Hello, yes, hi. My name is Isabella, and I am a fantasy dork who would love nothing more than to nerd out about the minutiae of fantasy for 10 minutes. So buckle up and let's get started. It's no joke or no secret that fantasy is my favorite genre. I love nerding out about it. I love escaping into fantasy worlds. It is my favorite thing. And I would love nothing more than to geek out about fantasy things and discuss my history with fantasy, where I would like to read more from, and all my opinions, not all my opinions, but a lot of opinions about fantasy, and this tag is perfect for it. It is the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. I initially saw this on Sam from Thoughts on Tomes channel, and currently I can't remember who originally did this video, but rest assured I will definitely leave a link below to the original video. Having 5 people and 2 dogs in a household is slowly driving me nuts. I can't do anything without someone bothering me, and trying to film stuff while also keeping this somewhat quiet is not going well. Question 1 asks, what is your fantasy origin story? How did you come to read your first fantasy book? And I don't have an interesting story, to be honest. I have always read and gravitated towards fantastical stories. When I was super young, it was stories about fairies and magical creatures and girls with powers, because that was stuff I was super into. I've always just gravitated towards fantasy. I've loved the escapist elements of it. I loved the entertaining, fast-paced, and imaginative elements of a fantasy story, and that has continued throughout my adult life. Question 2 asks, if you could be the hero of your story, which author would you choose to write your story, and what's one trope you would insist that they put in there? If I had to choose one, I might choose good old Laini Taylor, because I love her writing and I think she would give me a wonderful story. Or maybe even Erin Morgenstern. I have only read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, but her writing is also gorgeous. The elements in her stories were something I really enjoyed. As for a trope, I don't know. Ooh, maybe I would insist on a found family. That's definitely it. I love found family tropes. They're probably my favorite trope in fiction ever. So if I was given a found family in my fantasy story, I would definitely love that. Question 3 asks, what is a fantasy that you've read this year that you think more people should read? And a lot of the fantasy books I've read this year I don't think are necessarily underhyped, but I've chosen 2 that I would like to see more people reading. I would like to see more people reading N.K. Jemisin. I've read The Obelisk Gate this year and adored it. I think she is so phenomenal, so unique, and definitely a staple if you want to be versed in the fantasy genre. I might be a bit biased, but I think her work is fantastic. I also think I would like to see more people reading the Truthwitch series. I just started it this year. I've read Truthwitch and Windwitch now, and I've just really enjoyed my time. The characters in here are fantastic. The sisterly love between our 2 main female characters is wonderful. I can't wait to see where the rest of the series goes. And I definitely think this should be up there in terms of hype for like young adult fantasy stories. This one should be a lot higher up there than what is given credit to. Question 4 asks, what is your favorite subgenre of fantasy, and what is the subgenre that you've read the least from? This isn't very unique, but high fantasy, epic fantasy is my favorite subgenre. I just like being in an entirely different world where with a new magic system, new customs worlds. I love that element of fantasy, and it's best displayed, I think, when in a high fantasy, epic fantasy setting. My least favorite subgenre definitely has to be urban fantasy. I read a lot of urban fantasy paranormal fiction when I was younger, and a lot of it wasn't great, and a lot of adult urban fantasy is just like high-key like porn. And I'm not opposed to some smutty things in books, but I tend to like that more in just exclusively romance books and not in my fantasy. I am currently reading an urban fantasy though, and that's The Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. I am really enjoying that, so maybe I should change that. Question 5 asks, who is one of your auto-buy authors? My auto-buy author definitely has to be Laini Taylor. You can see my shrine usually in the back of my videos. I love her work. I think her writing is unmatched in its quality, and her worlds and just imagination is so amazing. It's also really nice to be able to talk about Laini Taylor because I haven't talked about her in a while because she hasn't put out a book in so long. But yeah, whenever she announces her next book, the pre-order button will be hit so fast. I also was trying to think of some other auto-buy authors, and there are some that I think will become so in the future, but I've only read like 2 books and that's all they have out, so none of those really count. And Leigh Bardugo I don't think is an auto-buy author anymore, just because I hated Ninth House so much. So I think Laini Taylor. Oh, and to expose some of my trash opinions, I think Cassandra Clare also is an auto-buy. But I've been reading her for like 10 years now. The next question asks, how do you typically find your recommendations? And BookTube mostly. I've followed a lot of fantasy reviewers recently, and I'm always looking for more. And Twitter also is a really good one, because just as you're scrolling, people are always talking about books and things that are upcoming and to keep your eye on. But yeah, Twitter and BookTube definitely are my go-tos. The next question asks, what is an upcoming fantasy release that you're excited for? And I've made it no secret, I have 2 most anticipated books of the entire year. The first one being The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty, final book in the Daevabad trilogy. Super excited for that, and it's coming kind of soon. We've got a few months left. Cannot wait for that. I'm also ridiculously excited and anticipating The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. We just got the cover, which is gorgeous, and I think this is supposed to be coming out December of 2020, which is a bit longer to wait, but I'm just glad we're getting it this year. Cannot wait for this book. These 2 finales, I'm dying to get my hands on. Question 8, I could talk about for a long time, and that's, what is one misconception that you want about fantasy and fantasy readers to be dispelled? I would love for people to not just generally disrespect fantasy as a genre. It is a genre that is not respected really in like literary communities, and people think that it really can't be literary, which is stupid. Look at like your Erin Morgensterns or your Madeline Millers. Fantasy is such an interesting vehicle to tell your story, and there's no way that it's not a literary or like provocative story, or like the ability to be those things. I would also love for the misconception of fantasy that is just written by and read by straight white older men. It's ridiculous. There are so many fantastic writers, authors of color, and queer people who are writing amazing fantasy stories. Look at just BookTube in general. A lot of the women on here absolutely love fantasy, and it's their favorite genre, and it's just so tiresome that it's still a misconception today. The final question asks, if someone has never read a fantasy before and asks you for some general recommendations, what are 3 that like pop into your head to get started with? And these are books that I actually thought about, because if you're getting into fantasy, I don't want to start you off with Lord of the Rings, because it's a mistake. I did come up with 3 series that I think do show some of the general things that fantasy has to offer. They're maybe not necessarily absolute favorites, although some are, and just I think would be a good stepping stone into reading fantasy books. For young adults, would recommend the Fallen Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes. This is an incredibly generic fantasy story, but I think it does well with some of the characters and just the general plot lines that you can see occur in a fantasy. It's not out of the box by any means, but the characters are enjoyable. The plot was okay, but I think a good starting place for a young or new fantasy reader. I also would recommend the Every Heart a Doorway series by Shauna McGuire, because this is a portal fantasy. It starts off, or can take place, in our world, but it also explores the magic and some of the traumas that can be inflicted of other magical worlds. There's so many magical worlds in here, so you can kind of see some of the things that could come up. And I think there's just a wonderful cast of characters in here, and they're really short, so you can get through them really, really quickly. And my final recommendation happens to be the Darker Shade of Magic series by Victoria Schwab. I haven't read these in a while, and I used to say that this was one of my favorite series, and I'm not sure about that anymore. But I do think this is a good place to start, or even if you're starting to read adult fiction, it's a really good stepping stone from young adult to adult. It has characters on the younger side. The magic system and worlds are not at all hard to grasp, and it's just a pretty fun, decently paced story from what I can remember. And this is one of the ones that I started with, or at least one of the adult fantasy series I started with. It's not at all inaccessible, definitely pretty easy to get through. So that is it for the video today. If there are any other tags out there, I would love to know about them, because I want to talk about fantasy all day, and it's really nice to talk about things I haven't talked about in a while. Laini Taylor, Shades of Magic. I haven't read them in a long time, so it's nice to discuss and recommend. Let me know down in the comments below if you have any recommendations for people starting with fantasy. I think the more the merrier in terms of those kinds of recommendations. And if you've done this tag, please let me know, because I would love to watch it. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!